Hello, Jody. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your wisdom with our students that are participating today. It looks like we have about 100 students listening in. So,
wow.
Jody Johnson is an esteemed faculty member in our Child Development Department at San Diego Canyon College. So for your best viewing experience, please ensure that your audio is always on mute unless Jody asks for you to participate and ask a question, and make sure that you're viewing in speaker view mode. So just choose side-by-side speaker view, and your camera can be on or off, your choice, as Jody says. And please raise your hand in the chat tool for questions, or type your question in the chat, and Jody, I'll keep track of them. If you'd like me to interject with questions, great, or otherwise we'll keep them till the end.
Absolutely. Okay, so in this workshop, we're going to talk about why is it important to be trauma informed as going into the education field. So that's the title of this. So next slide, please. So it's just a little bit about myself. I have a master's in early childhood education. I was always curious about why it seemed like we spent a lot of money on education, and we were trying all these different programs, but we weren't getting anywhere with increased reading scores, increased math scores. And I always felt that there must be something going on somewhere else. And so I started looking into trauma. I started with attachment theory and then moved into different things. And 2 years ago, I finished a second master's in trauma and resilience in education, pre-K through 12. And that pretty much answered a lot of my questions as to what's going on with children and what's affecting their learning. And so through that master's and through some invitations to serve on some state boards that are part of underneath the Surgeon General of the state of California. I'm now helping make a difference and helping direct policy in that area. So it's a really exciting time to be in this field because there's so much information coming out about trauma. Next slide, please. So the goals of this session are what is trauma? When I first heard about it, I thought it was a car wreck. I thought, oh, that must be it. And so I learned a lot from that point on. So what is resilience and how does the resilience interplay with trauma? Then we're going to look at what are trauma-informed classrooms. And then the final piece is self-care for educators. And so that's our So I'm an activity. So this was my idea of like, when you think of the word trauma, what comes to mind? What are those words that come to mind in your end? You can put those in the chat box, or you can you can also unmute yourself and just say a word. Either way is fine. So I can see the chat box. So when you think about that word trauma, injury, that's where I went first too. Emotional, something you went through. Some pain, fear, damage, social, yes, all of those things. I can see bad home environment. Well, of challenge, yes, lots of those stress, pain-free. And have we not been going through a lot of this and added on to that this past year with COVID? Absolutely. So when we think of traumatic experiences, COVID has actually meets all the criteria for being considered trauma. So what we're going through right now with all of this, it's affected every aspect of our life, essentially. It's changed the way we think, what we do, what we feel, how we feel from day to day. And it's created a lot of unsettling feelings in people, some strong feelings about insecurity in terms of food insecurity, housing insecurity, job insecurity. What happens next? Do I go out? Do I not? What do I do? It's constantly changing. So what trauma is, next slide, please. So it's an event or an experience that threatens or causes harm to one's physical, emotional well-being. And it really, what happens is it's an experience that this experience or experiences, they overwhelm the body's ability to cope. And how it affects people is different for everybody. And then on the other hand, we also have, not only is it different for everybody, but the effects that happen as a result of trauma, they vary based on the intensity, the frequency, and the timing. So for if you grew up maybe in a abusive home where there was domestic violence going on, that's maybe a pattern that was laid down for you. And so you think about, when I grow up, I'm not going to do this to my children, or I'm not going to do that, or I'm going to do something different. So you're already at that point starting to make coping strategies for dealing with that and breaking that chain. Some people who experience trauma have the ability to just put it like in, I don't know how I'm going to say it, put it where they can deal with it. And other people, trauma can just overwhelm them and leave them feeling very much depressed and in need of help. And so we're going to talk about we have a video coming up. Next slide, please. And what is trauma? And this explains it really well. So it's about a 6-minute video. So let's go with that. And this will explain it.
Work for brain development. However, genes do not design the brain completely. Environmental influences, nurture, fine-tune how the brain works by shaping which brain connections get used. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent, whereas ones that do not get much use fade away. Together, genes and the environment build the foundation for all future development. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships early in life lead to healthy development. But children's brains capture other experiences as well, stressful events. However, not all stress is bad. Positive stress involves normal childhood experiences, like starting daycare or meeting a new person for the first time. This stress is essential for healthy development because it helps children develop coping skills and confidence. But when stress is frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled, it is toxic to children, especially when they do not have a caregiver to provide support or buffer the stress. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to intimate partner violence, parental depression or addiction, and poverty are toxic stressors which could lead to lifelong changes in learning and behavior. ACEs early in development can impact social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, increased risk-taking behavior such as drinking and substance use, and increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems later in life. The question is, how do adverse childhood experiences impact a lifelong development? One of the most important systems in our body is our stress system. It's activated when we experience stress. We become alert, our heart rate increases, and so do our stress hormone levels, cortisol and adrenaline. Our body is ready to react, what is known as fight or flight. A short period of time after the stress is over, or if a child receives support from a caregiver, the stress response turns off and the body returns to a normal state. Adverse childhood experiences create stress responses that stay active, and without the support of a caregiver, the system has difficulty shutting off completely. This constant and prolonged activation can affect immune system functioning and increase the chances of sickness, infection, and disease. Prolonged activation of stress hormones is also toxic to the brain. Certain areas of the brain are more vulnerable to toxic stress, including the executive center or the brain's control center, an area important for solving complex problems, attention, reasoning, impulsivity, inhibition, and learning. A second area is the emotional center, the brain's alarm system, which is involved in processing and interpreting emotions and the ability to control impulses. The third area is the memory and learning center, the brain's filing cabinet, which plays a major role in learning and the formation and retrieval of memories. Science shows that adverse childhood experiences impact all of these brain centers. Behaviorally, what we begin to see is emotional distress, poor emotion regulation, greater impulsivity, learning difficulties, and physical and mental health problems. More recently, science has begun to look at how ACEs cause changes in gene expression through a process called epigenetics, which helps us understand how nature and nurture interact. Epigenetics causes changes in the way genes work without changing the DNA code itself. This occurs through chemical changes influencing how the code is used. In other words, genes are like the hardware in a computer. They determine the boundaries of what is possible. However, we need an operating system to tell the hardware what to do. Epigenetics is like the operating system directing the function of a gene's DNA hardware. The genes we are born with are the genes that we have for life, but experiences like nutrition, exercise, smoking, stressors, and relationships all affect our biology. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with epigenetic changes related to stress, brain development, cognition, and systems associated with mental and physical health. Changes that happen early in brain development are more likely to be enduring and are possibly passed on to future generations as well. The good news is that positive, supportive relationships at any stage in life can make a difference. However, supporting families and children early on will help prevent many of these negative outcomes. One of the key ingredients for healthy development is having warm, loving, and actively engaged caregivers. This involves promoting serve and return interactions, where caregivers actively and warmly engage with the child, making eye contact, responding to sounds, words, gestures, emotional needs, and sharing experiences like reading and play. Providing programs that support caregivers to strengthen these abilities are the blocks that build healthy foundations for life.
So that was a lot of information in a short amount of time about adverse childhood experiences. So when we think about that, they talked about the historical pieces of experiences that happened in your life. So they did a study in 1988, it came out. It was called the ACEs study. It's the foundation for a lot of this research. And they studied people, came out with started with a weight loss program, and they couldn't figure out whether they'd get patients would lose weight, then all of a sudden they gained it back again. And they did another person was researching on the East Coast, and he was doing smoking cessation research. And what the two researchers found out when they started talking to each other was people would be successful and all of a sudden they'd fall back and they would gain a lot of weight and even more back. And when they started asking them questions about their earlier childhood, they found out that they had these 10 original ACEs that they whittled all this information down into. So they had, they'd experienced domestic violence at home. Perhaps they'd lived in a home where a member of the family was incarcerated. They had experienced abuse. They'd experienced sexual abuse. They, of some type or another, inappropriate contact by a family member or another person close to the family. And alcoholism in the family, drug abuse. So if you had somebody where that was all happening, these were these 10 ACEs that originally came about. But then when they started looking at, okay, those are those research ACEs, but now we have a lot of other factors that we have to think about also as well that are now affecting child outcomes. And you look at them, a lot of them have to do at the top half of the tree, what we see above, a lot of those have to do are more prevalent in lower socioeconomic groups, families where they have children may not have access to technology, the housing instability, food instability, and COVID has certainly exacerbated the number of people who are affected by that. But then underneath all of that, within the epigenetics of our DNA code that they talked about, are things like historical things that have happened where you've had a history of maybe racism has been a problem, or immigration where you've been discriminated against from multiple generations with violence, all this. So there's all these things that keep you from getting ahead in life. And so so when we think of with adverse child experiences, we can have immediate responses, we can have delayed responses, or we can have just even forget. But all of these adverse experiences, they prime our body to a point where we get into this fight, flight, or freeze mode. And the more often that our body is in that, especially when we're young, the more deeply rooted that sense of how we react to situations happens. So children who are born and who are in a home where there's a lot of violence, or where it doesn't have to be a lot, where they experience violence, their systems are primed to be on the lookout for what's coming next. It's a very unpredictable environment. And when they're in that, what we call the limbic system of the brain, where they're way down in the reptilian brain, where it's just focusing on breathing and getting food and sleep and shelter and all the basic needs to stay alive, all the neurological activity stays in that area, and it doesn't allow the brain circuitry to go up into the limbic system, where emotions are happening, where auditory and verbal expression takes place. So think about a child who is upset about something, and you ask them, what happened? Well, they might not be able to tell you because they don't have the words, because that part of their brain is really kind of tuned out, that's not there. And so you have to get them to a point where they're more regulated and able to get to that part of their brain. And then the other part of the brain after the limbic system is the prefrontal cortex. And that's where that higher order thinking, that emotional regulation takes place, the planning, all the executive functions take place right there. And so if your body is constantly under stress and primed to be on the lookout for stress, that's not going to be a brain that is going to be receptive to learning, and it's going to have more trouble with that. So when we think about stress, the good side of that is that there's also this piece called resilience, and resilience is the ability to develop healthy adaptations despite adversity. So you probably think of somebody in your life, somebody who's like, man, they just power through. They can just get through anything and nothing seems to bother them. And things happen. It just rolls right off of them. They know how to make a plan. They know how to move forward with their life. They're resilient. And some of that has to do with our biology, our genetic makeup, our temperament, and some of that has to do with just being able to overcome and having what they talked about was that significant person in your life who helps you, is there for you, that those nurturing relationships. They're doing a lot of research right now on the power of positive experiences and how those positive experiences can actually override and are a protective factor against the adversity that people have experienced earlier in life. And so resilience, then, it's not something that you either have or you don't have. It's not, there's no gene in you that says, I'm resilient or I'm not. That's not a genetic type of thing. It's not a single strength, character trait, and it's not an attitude. It's not an outcome that is going to resolve your trauma. Just because I'm resilient doesn't mean that I'm going to forget that I lived in a home with somebody who had a mental illness and life was chaotic all of the time. I never knew what to expect. So it's not going to help with that type of a situation. It's not something that it's not going to fix that situation. You're still going to remember it, but how you deal with it is another story. So it's not something that's fixed or static. So you can be resilient. You may have not been resilient at one point in your life, but you build resilience through activities that help you regulate your body, whether that's through exercise, whether it's through meditation, gardening, things that make you feel good and bring you peace and calm into your life. And then resilience it's not just bouncing back, because you can, sometimes that's like just, okay, I'm just going to put that experience back in, I'm just going to push it away. And then I'm just going to bounce back and move forward. So that's not necessarily what with trauma and resilience, there are some protective factors that I talked about. And some of them are internal and some of them are external. So the internal factors are having a sense of optimism, hope, positivity. Some people would call that grit, but it's more than that. It's that positive approach to life. And how can I solve the problems? It's looking at that with problem-solving approach to trauma. Okay, this is happening in my life. What can I do so that will help me get through that? And sometimes it's talking to people. Sometimes it's getting mental health help. Sometimes it's having a group of friends that you can get together with in your, perhaps at school or in your church. And whoop, can't touch that mouse. And then, wait, I went the wrong way. Sorry. There we go. But it's the ability to regulate your own emotions and your behaviors also that helps. So that's that self-consciousness of understanding where you're at, what my response is, and thinking about your response in terms of how is this going to play out for me? If I just am so angry and I get in a car and go drive someplace, what's the good about that, and how's that going to work out? What might happen if I do that? To be self-motivated, that's another internal factor that has that growth mindset. And somebody who has an internal factors that are also protective are that you're able to make and form friendships. Those are really important because relationships really help. That's the single most protective factor for coping with ACEs, is having the support of somebody, that one person can make a difference in your life. You can think back to a teacher maybe in your life who was really motivating, and you knew that they cared, or whether it's a teacher, whether it's somebody in your life, somebody like that who, those are the people that can really help with dealing with trauma. And then there are external factors as well, like I talked about, the caring support and guidance from school counselors, socioeconomic status. That's just more, you're more likely to have resources. If your income level is higher, you tend to have more access to resources. That's nurturing environments like your school, community, place of worship, having cultural connections, opportunity that you can take on to develop confidence and competence. Maybe you take up a new activity or a new sport, something like that, that helps you feel like you're learning and growing. How many of you took up something new during COVID? Like decided, oh, I'm going to learn how to bake, or I'm going to learn how to cook something different. I'm going to take up cake decorating. All those things help build resilience. And if you think about it, during these times of COVID, how did you feel when you were doing something new and different and trying something new you probably felt good. And that's helping. That's helping you cope with these adverse experiences. Having positive relationships and role models, and having positive experiences and events. Not forgetting those celebrations that happen, even though we have to do them differently, or we've had to have them do them differently, the drive-by birthdays, the drive-by graduations. We just had to make adjustments, but we still had those experiences. They weren't the same as maybe what your older siblings or other people had, but we still celebrated. It was just in a different way. So when you think about a brain and a learning brain versus, I found this video and I thought this was a good explanation of how this all affects learning. So for those of you who are going into teaching.
Hey, welcome back. Today, I really want to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness. And it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid. Brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. Mm-hmm. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
So what did you think about that?
Great video.
Yeah, isn't it a really good video? So that really explains that. So if you have children who are always in this just trying to survive, that flight, fight, or freeze mode that we've heard that phrase, their brains are just not open to learning. And so if you're trying to get them to learn and you're trying to explain things and you're explaining over and over and over, and it's just not sinking in, it's not that the child has a learning disability. That's what we need to stop and go, wait a minute, what do we know about this child's life? What do we know about what's happening? And think about it from a different perspective. So one of the things for sure is we know what we will have students with a trauma history in your classroom. If you're teaching, that's going to happen. Just like it's going to happen that you are going to have children with special needs in your classroom, particularly if you are teaching in early childhood where children, a lot of times, especially when they're 3 or so, that's the first time that they come into contact with other children and then parents and even the child starts to know, maybe I'm different than other people. I can't, and parents mostly start to know that it's that, well, maybe my child's, not learning like they're not doing what the other kids are doing. And the teachers will bring that up to the parents. And the parents a lot of times will have the idea that, oh, they're just going to grow out of it. It's just a phase. And so part of early childhood is that's the first time they come in contact maybe with finding out that they may need to have additional screening. And so the earlier we can get to these kids and get them the kind of treatments and therapies and services that they need, the more likely they're going to be successful. Well, with children who come into our class with a trauma history, how are we going to find that out unless we kind of get to know the parents maybe a little bit, know the families a little bit, not just jump that there's a learning problem? I think it is, because the trauma is likely to interfere with their learning, just like the speaker in the last video said. And these effects can be pervasive and permeating. They can be immediate, delayed, or hidden. Like you might have this real inconsistent. So one day they come in and the children are fine. And then maybe something happened at home that night. And the next day they come into class and they're totally dysregulated. And you think, oh my gosh, what's going on with this child? So one of the things that a lot of schools are adopting is these programs where everybody is knows the child's name. It's that whole mama elephant herd approach where all of the staff is really clued into being that positive influence on the child's life and creating this environment where children feel safe, they feel nurtured, they feel secure, and that promotes their learning in the classroom. And so the other piece of this is now, if you're dealing with children who have a trauma history or are displaying behaviors in the class, you may also be triggered by maybe something that happened in your life that happened in a child's life. And so something in your history the child may do something that may actually trigger you, or the other piece is that particularly if you're working in schools in low income areas, there can be so much going on, it can just be exhausting. Like I'm sure that I've talked to a lot of teachers who are teaching online in COVID right now, even preschool, they're exhausted. There's no way they can keep the children's attention anymore, not even they have them for an hour and they say, I just can't do it. The kids are done with learning online. They don't want to learn online anymore. as fun as we try to make it, it's just not happening. But the part to be aware of is your own personal and mental health as a teacher or in any kind of caring profession, that you have to understand that you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of other people, that put on the oxygen mask before you put on the oxygen mask of a child or somebody else. You have to take care of yourself as an educator. It's very, very demanding to have 30 children in your class and all of them having different needs. And now that they're going to be coming back to classrooms after COVID, how are these children going to be affected by COVID? And what are we going to see in the classroom? And a lot of that's going to depend on the quality of life that the children had, the quality of experience that the children had while they were, basically while we had to be separated from each. I hate to say locked down. I was trying to avoid that, but that's pretty much what we were. We had to be quarantined. And so what we have is, children haven't seen other children. They haven't played with other children. So their social skills may actually need a lot of work, learning how to negotiate and be with other children. They may have spent a lot of time on electronic devices or in front of the TV. And so we have to think about that. So how is that going to affect their attention span in the classroom? And so there's a lot of things to consider as we're moving forward out of this. And so the big piece is about taking care of yourself as an educator or any kind of caregiver. That's so important. So the implications for the students who have had trauma is, if you've been exposed to trauma, as I said, they're going to spend a lot of their energy responding to, coping with, and coming to terms with events that may have occurred in their life. Left untreated, there's an increase for children not meeting the developmental markers and a greater likelihood for mental health disorders later on in life, as well as other disorders that affect their health. So from the ACEs study, they found that the screening was 10 questions, and if you had experienced any one of these 10 ACEs, they called them, adverse childhood experience, you got 1 point. And then you added up the points, and that was your ACE score. If you have high ACEs, what they found, like 4 or more, what they found is it tends to affect your health later on in life. You're more likely to have high blood pressure. You're more likely to be obese. You're more likely to have heart disease, stroke, cancer, and even to the point where you could actually, depending on the ACEs in your health overall, you could actually end up dying 20 years earlier, have a 20 years shorter life expectancy because of adverse childhood experiences and how they played out in your health. And so it's really important to take care of yourself and to think about your own ACEs and how you deal with those, and to make sure that you get help that you need to engage in those self-care practices and to reduce the stressors in your life. The other piece is that there's a high referral rate to special education when mental health services are needed. And so that's what we find with children is it's not that they have a learning disability. They have been affected by the trauma in their life. And so when we can reduce the stress in the children and help them learn how to self-regulate and reduce their own stress by maybe going to the quiet area in the classroom where they can just play with widgets or read a book or just look at water globes. Those things can be very calming, and then they can rejoin the classroom and their brain's in a different place and they're ready to learn. What I wanted to say is just make a difference and be the one, as Bruce Perry says, be the one person in a child's life make a difference. Be that positive influence on your students if you're going into teaching, but also take care of yourself. So do you have questions? I don't know how much time we have left.
Yes, Jody, we just have a few minutes. This is
Okay,
Janice,
good.
and I'm going to go ahead and ask just a couple questions that came up. And if there's a couple
Great.
more that students want to put in the chat, that's fantastic.
Okay.
One that came very early, and you may have answered this, is can some people not know they are suffering trauma because that's all they know?
Absolutely. Because how do we know what's normal until we get out and get away from it and find, like, I can remember one of personal experience. I went to like a friend's house and their parents were yelling and screaming at each other. I'd never experienced that in my entire life. And I didn't know what that was. And I was like, what? How does that happen? And so when you think about that, yes, you can have, and the brain can do things like repress those memories as well. And so there are parts, especially in cases of sexual abuse, where children can certainly repress that, and that just takes that's going to probably take therapy to get through that. But yes, you cannot know. I'm teaching a course right now, Trauma and Resilience. It's called The Child as Victim, but it's being reworked into a course on trauma and resilience right now. And one of the things a lot of my students were saying is, I didn't know any difference. This was just, not only was it normal in my home, but it was normal in my culture. And this isn't by any means saying that one culture is better than the other. But it is like, if that's all you knew and that's what all you saw was around you, it's going to seem very normal.
Okay.
The thing is how do you feel inside when those events are happening? How does that feel? How did that affect you in terms of your feelings of safety and security and feelings of confidence?
Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in now, and I want to try to address them for 11:35. So some of the students are concerned about, is it true that we'll have to face a lot of children with trauma after the COVID isolation? Did you want to expand a little bit on what you were saying, what you think about that?
We don't know, because we don't know what's been happening in the kids' homes. One of the interesting things is during COVID, the number of calls about child abuse have gone way down. So what does that mean? Does it mean it's not happening at a time when stress is like through the roof for a lot of these families? How can that be? That's part of the question. So we don't know, because we're not getting this feedback. Where at schools, you have the school nurse, you have teachers checking and going, oh, okay, there's an unusual bruise on a child, or, oh, well, that child seems like they haven't had a bath, or they're not well cared for. They've been neglected, and they're not eating. They come into school hungry. So we don't know, because they're not in school right now. My suspicion is that it's more.
Yeah. And actually, some of our students ask such great questions. And what we want to do is have them trust their education that they're going to continue to get. Because right now it seems maybe more scary than what it will once they receive more of their education. So I just want to encourage our students. Could you put up our ending slide with the QR code before I ask the rest of the questions? This is the QR code for the students, or the link to please go on and give us feedback about this workshop presentation and what you learned, and did you feel like it was important information for you? So please use this before you sign off. This is from Kate Toller. What kinds of things can be implemented into classrooms to assist students that have trauma?
A predictable routine is probably going to be one of the most important, because if you're in that trauma bank and you don't know what's coming next, you're going to be dysregulated. But when you have that consistent routine, and that's going to be really important as kids come back, and you'll find that as well, that gives them a sense of security. Any little disruption in the routines, without like saying, okay, tomorrow we're going to have, a guest speaker. We're going to have somebody come in the classroom, which is probably not going to happen, but because of COVID. But any little thing that's going to change your routine. You want to make sure that the children are prepared for that. Predictability is going to be super important right now.
Okay, perfect. Yes. And then we have a question from Brenda. How do you deal with children's trauma when it triggers you? Because you may experience something like that too.
And that's the self-care piece that is really going to be important, because sometimes we don't even realize that it happens. So it's within the school culture, and you'll find this out because a lot of schools are doing this, where it's called tap in and tap out. When you need a break, you go tap out, you get some help, you get somebody to come in for your classroom for a few minutes, and you go out and you take that break and you get yourself together. Because just like the children can't learn when their brain is in the survival mode, you can't teach either when your brain is in the survival mode. So yes, there is that triggering that goes on with children. And so yeah, you have to be aware, just like we have to be aware of our biases that we have when we're teaching, we also have to be aware of what could trigger us within children. And it's a learning process. When you're a new teacher, you may not know, but it's knowing yourself, knowing your trauma history, and taking care of yourself as well. That's important. And dealing with whatever is in your life. That is really important.
Right.
And that's for any profession.
Right. And you had a great slide up earlier on internal and external factors and things that we can do for ourselves to address our own trauma. And it's such a great question, Brenda, because we as future teachers, and we're responsible for those bodies in our classroom, we must work on dealing with our own trauma so that we can be as healthy as possible. But the tapping in and tapping out is a great resource, and you will develop relationships with your colleagues, and you'll have some close partners that it might take a 10-minute conversation to get you through it. And then maybe you reflecting on that and saying, what do I need to do about that situation so that I can take care of my own trauma and be healthy first. So
right, absolutely important. But that's a great question.
That's a great question. Jody, it has been a pleasure, and we're so grateful that you took your time today to talk to future teachers, actually from all over the state. We've had so many students from various community colleges as well. And I'm sure they have great programs on their campuses, but they can see how wonderful ours is by experiencing this today.
And we are working on building out a trauma certificate for educators. So we're working on that. So
well, as long as and now that some of our classes are online, students have the opportunity from all over the place to take the certificate or the degree program they like. Thank you so much, Jody.
Okay,
everybody
you're
take
welcome.
care.
Okay, bye-bye.